Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we're taking a look at another early French cavalry carbine. However, this isn't just for any old guy on a horse, this is specifically for a cuirassier. These were the French heavy cavalry that were equipped with fancy metal plumed helmets and fancy shiny metal breastplates, or cuirass. And this cuirass had been introduced in 1855, and at the time it was actually a pretty decent piece of armor. It was great against swords, and it would even be effective against a black powder pistol bullet, or even a rifle bullet at sufficient range. So it made sense. And these guys were fancy, they were very prestigious. There was a lot of honor in being a cuirassier. And in 1890, when the French adopted the Berthier Cavalry Carbine, this guy, they decided to make a version of it specifically for the cuirassier. Now, there were a couple things that they had to do differently for these guys because of their armor. So they had the helmet had this kind of scaled cheek piece that made it difficult to get a good cheek weld on a standard rifle or carbine. And they also are wearing this slick metal breastplate. So if you have a metal butt plate on the gun and you're wearing a chunk of metal, that thing's just going to slip around an awful lot. So the version of the cavalry carbine that they made for these guys had no comb on the stock so that they could actually get a cheek weld on it with their helmets, and it had a leather butt plate. We'll take a closer look at that in just a moment, but the idea was leather would be kind of sticky, and it would actually stay in place on the metal armor much better than a standard butt plate would. So other than that, these carbines are identical to the standard cavalry carbine. They use the same 3-round end block clip. They're still chambered for the 8mm Lebel cartridge. Sights are the same. The stock is basically the same. They don't have bayonet lugs because these guys were equipped with sabers or lances, and they didn't need an edged weapon on the rifle. This was, in fact, in some ways, this was actually considered a backup weapon. So our markings on this rifle are pretty typical, with the exception of the fact that someone, for some reason, has ground off the manufacturer's mark on this particular one. It would have originally said Châtellerault because all of the cuirassier carbines were made by Châtellerault. We have a serial number and controller and inspection stamps up here. Because these were made by Châtellerault, they have an A prefix on the serial number, and they run from 1 to 20,000. The rear sight is totally standard, exactly the same as a normal cavalry carbine. However, this one has been mildly sporterized. It should not have this sling swivel. Originally, just like the first model of cavalry carbines, these would have had a ring on the side of the front band here to connect to a sling swivel on the bottom of the butt. So this sling swivel is not the exact right style, but it is in the right place. There would have been a sling swivel here and then that ring. Also, originally, these were set up with the same clearing rod that was in the cavalry carbines. On this one, the rod has been removed or lost at some point, and the slot has been filled in. I believe that was done by the same person who modified the sling swivels. This was a modification that was not done until 27 by standard French decree, but all of the cuirassier carbines had been removed and rebuilt by 1920, or shortly after 1920, so I don't believe that this is an original French modification. Now, the interesting bit here is this leather butt plate. It is 2 pieces of leather held in place by 3 wood screws. Those screws are actually glued into the stock to make sure that they don't come out. Interestingly, and there was one prototype that I saw where they actually had a slot that was kind of pressed into the butt plate where it would fit on a reinforcing bar on the 1855 cuirass, or fit on the edge at the armhole on the cuirass. That was not adopted ultimately, but it's interesting that they experimented with it. That would have held the butt plate in place even better when firing, but I guess they decided not necessary. But there's the standard leather butt plate. And when comparing the buttstock to a standard cavalry carbine, you can obviously see the difference. The comb here has been removed so you can get a cheek weld with that helmet. So what's really interesting about these, I think, is how they were actually used, because as we all would expect today, guys in shiny metal armor charging on horseback are like the stereotypical first guys to get massacred in World War I. And, you know, the French weren't idiots. They figured this out. And by 1915, all of the cavalry units had been redeployed as infantry. But because of the heritage of the units and the pride of being in one of these very elite units, they actually went into the trenches in all of their cavalry gear. So when the cuirassiers in 1915 headed into to replace infantry in the trenches, they did so wearing metal helmets and wearing metal breastplates, and those actually weren't totally useless. And because they had those, they also took their standard carbines, and it was in that way, with those first cavalry units getting into the trenches, that the French really recognized just how handy and effective a little short carbine like this would be in the trenches. This would, of course, lead to a heavy use of 1916 pattern carbines later in the war. The French really adopted and used the carbine more than any other service, and it's because they had these cavalry guys jumping into the trenches relatively early in the war. So I think that's really cool. There were only 20,000 of these made in the first place back in 1891, and it is extremely rare to find them today. There's only a handful of them known outside of museums. So this one's not quite perfect, as we discussed, but very cool to find one in its original condition. So, I should say, during the war, it was authorized whenever one of these guns got damaged, they would rebuild it as a standard 1892 pattern with a normal stock and a bayonet lug. And then after the war in, I believe, 1920, it was decreed that all the rest of the rifles that were still in inventory in this form would be taken out and rebuilt as standard model of 1916 carbines. So that's why they're so scarce to find today. Not a whole lot of them made it through the war intact, and then of those, basically everything that was left in French inventory was rebuilt. So the only ones that survive are ones that came home as souvenirs during the war or just after the war. Anyway, if you enjoy this sort of content, first off, stay tuned, because this is part of an ongoing series on French bolt-action rifles, and actually French military rifles in general. And we will continue in a few days with the next updated version of the Berthier. If you like this, do also consider checking out my Patreon page. It's the support from people there that make it possible for me to do extended series of videos like this one on interesting and less covered topics. And if you're a big fan of French rifles and the French military and you think that some of the jokes just aren't fair, well, take a look at the shirt, the one that I'm currently wearing actually while filming. This is available for a limited time through the Forgotten Weapons shop, and check it out. There's a link in the description text below. Thanks for watching.